the first one I chose is probably one of the most contentious finds, and that's Jericho. Jericho is actually, the battle still rages on for Jericho in the field of archaeology. People would have said that the debate was finished in the 1950s, but there's some scholars now who are questioning some of that because the work in the 1950s was actually not completed. Jericho, the city, was originally discovered in 1867 by British engineer Charles Warren. It was one of 9 mounds that Warren had hypothesized were artificially made, not natural. Right? What do we call that? A tell. So he said, you look on the field, he goes, look, there's 8 of these mounds that just don't fit. I bet you there's cities under there. So in 1867-68, Warren starts to dig out Jericho. It was dug a second time in 1907 through 1911 by Sellen and Watzinger. They cataloged various pottery but didn't have a well-developed chronology that they could compare the pottery styles of the time against anything else. So they thought Jericho was unoccupied somewhere between 1550 to 1200 BC, which would put Joshua's conquest much later than we would have thought. Joshua should have probably, in the biblical chronology, you're looking at somewhere, well, let me see. If they conquer at if they conquer at 1400 BC, we have 400 years till King David, which is right about 1000 BC. And then we have another 400 years till Nebuchadnezzar, which is about, we know where that is. We know that's 587 BC. And then we go on from there. So a lot of people are figuring about 13th century, about 1400 BC, late Bronze II age, that Joshua is conquered. But he's saying that he thought that maybe that city was abandoned between 1500s and the 1200s. That would push Joshua late. That would have to compress the biblical chronology. John Garstang, a British archaeologist, questioned these results and mounted an expedition of his own to gather further evidence regarding the date of the fortifications at Jericho. Garstang was the first investigator to use modern methods at the site, although his work was still crude by today's standards because he was digging in the mid-1930s. Garstang also excavated a residential area on the southeast slopes of the mound he believed was part of the city, fortified by a double wall. He designated this area, so this is away from the main dig, City 4, and it had been thoroughly destroyed in a violent conflagration. So here's an area he thought might have been residential, but the walls were just completely collapsed. Garstang concluded that City 4 came to an end about 1400 BCE. And based on pottery found in the destruction, we were able to look at the bugs that were in the tombs and on the absence of Mycenaean ware. So in other words, it's kind of like, remember in the 80s when everything was made in Japan and now everything's made in China? That idea. The pottery is like, okay, the Mycenaeans hadn't moved in yet to make the pottery, so we can give it a better idea. Okay. He ascribed the destruction to invading Israelites. The matter seemed settled in Garstang's mind, and in quote, he says, in a word, in all material details and in date, the fall of Jericho took place as described in the biblical narrative. Our demonstration is limited, however, to the material observations. The walls fell, shaken apparently by earthquake, and the city was destroyed by fire about 1400 BC. These are the basic facts resulting from our investigation. The link with Joshua and the Israelites is only circumstantial, but it seems to be solid and without flaw. So he's putting forth a really strong case that, hey, we found the walls fell out the way they were, fire was burned, timing's right, it fits. Well, another British archaeologist comes back a couple of decades later. Her name is Kathleen Kenyon, and she starts digging Jericho in the 50s. Now, Kenyon is a minimalist in her archaeological presupposition, and she approached this site and said, "No, this can't be right." This is a quote for her, "No, certainly not. There was no city there at the time Joshua supposedly conquered it." Now, Kenyon based her opinion almost exclusively on the absence of pottery imported from Cyprus and common to the late Bronze First period, which is 1550 to 1400. This imported Cypriote ware had been previously found mainly in some Megiddo tombs. Now, Megiddo and Jericho are not necessarily right next to each other. But Kenyon used this pottery to construct her ceramic typology for the late Bronze I period. So she's assuming that the pottery pattern that we find in Megiddo, right, which is on the western side of Israel, would match the pottery that we would find in Joshua's Jericho on the eastern shore of the, on the eastern side on the river. And so, but it says during her lifetime, Kenyon never published a definitive study of the pottery, though, from the last phases of City 4 before its destruction. So she makes these statements off of initial finds. She never does a complete excavation or a complete analysis of the pottery. The final excavation reports published after her death reflect Kenyon's meticulous field work, and they can contain complete and detailed presentation of her excavation results, but they only present the raw data, not her analysis, because she had passed on. So another guy comes along in the current age, within the last 30 years. His name is Brian Wood, and they start coming to a different conclusion when they start examining the evidence. Now, Kenyon herself, even though she's a minimalist, she does say this about Jericho. She says, "The destruction was complete." This is a quote. "Walls and floors were blackened or reddened by fire, and every room was filled with fallen bricks, timbers, and household utensils. In most rooms, the fallen debris was heavily burnt, but the collapse of the walls of the eastern room seemed to have taken place before they were affected by fire." So even Kenyon, a minimalist, says the walls fell down, and then someone came in and burnt the city. Okay? Now, Wood and some of his colleagues start reading Kenyon's work really closely, and they find some interesting things that they can draw from it. First of all, Kenyon herself said that City 4 had an impressive fortification system. This fortification system consisted, first of all, of a stone redevement wall, some 15 feet high at the base of the mound. At the northern end of the site, all three archaeological expeditions to Jericho found remnants of mud brick parapet walls on the top of the redevement wall to a height of about 8 feet. So they got 15 feet plus 8. That's pretty impressive. And if you remember, the Jericho soldiers in the story were walking along the top of the wall, so parapets make sense. You'd shoot an arrow. Parapet's the thing that, like a top of a castle, where you can have a gap and look through it in order to shoot an arrow. So it is likely that this parapet wall originally extended all the way around the city. Despite the fact that the area where the upper wall once stood is gone, there is evidence, incredible as it may seem, that this wall came tumbling down, and in the words of the biblical account of Joshua, fell down flat. The evidence comes from Kenyon's own careful stratigraphic excavation and the detailed final reports that describe it. Again, those reports published after she's dead, so she doesn't make any conclusions from there. Both Garstang earlier and Kenyon found large quantities of grain stored in the ground floor rooms of the houses, and this gets Wood really thinking. Now, this is very strange, since if there was a long siege, right, if the armies are outside, think of it this way. You got big walls that nobody can conquer. So what's the army going to do? They're going to sit around the outside of the wall and make sure nobody leaves the city. And this happened to Israel. It actually happened to the northern kingdom with the Assyrians, and it happened to Jerusalem when Nebuchadnezzar tried to take it down. And what they do is they just wait. The invading army sits there and they starve you out. Remember, all your fields are outside the city walls. And if you have a river that you rely on and it doesn't run through the city, well, what do for your water? You die. You hope for a rain, I guess. This is why Hezekiah built a tunnel under the wall in order to get to a spring on the outside. He dug it. It's an amazing thing. You can still walk it today. You can actually go in there and see that these two groups actually worked together and they met. And how they did this with, candlelight and no GPS or anything. I don't know how they did it, but it's an amazing thing that they did. So they were thinking, well, if you got these big walls, how do you conquer that city? You starve them out. But that's not what happened here, because there's all this grain. Why, if you have food, you eat it, right? So why did the city fall and leave all the food there? So they say successful attackers normally plundered valuable grain once they captured a city. So even if there was grain left over and the invading army, knocks the city down, maybe somebody leaves a door unlocked. Oops, let's go in. And that did happen. That's what happened to Belshazzar in Babylon. He left the stinking door unlocked. He was so... Well, that's not quite true. I'm being a little flippant. They plugged up the river and crawled under the gate. So that's what they did. But your army's just as hungry, and it's tough to bring supplies all the way back from your homeland. So if you come across the enemy's grain, what do? You eat it. That's what you do as an invading army. So this grain is a big puzzle. Successful attackers normally plundered valuable grain once they captured a city. This, of course, would be inconsistent with the grain found there, but in the case of Jericho, the Israelites were forbidden to take any of the plunder, if you remember. That could explain why there was so much left to burn while city 4 met its end. Another inference can be drawn from the grain. And this is the second thing that archaeologists will say, well, if there's a lot of grain, that means that this probably happened in the fall because it was right after the harvest. If it was in the spring, you wouldn't have all that grain in your storehouse. Okay, so this is what we know about Jericho. You can draw conclusions. Like I said, it's not an exact science, but we can see that there's a lot of parallels with the Joshua account, especially the city 4 area that matches with the dating of Joshua. It matches that the walls fell. It matches the fact that the city was burned by fire, and it matches that no Israelites were to take anything. This comes from Joshua 2, 5 through 7, verse 15, chapter 6, verses 5 and 20. The inhabitants had no opportunity to flee with their foodstuffs, Joshua 6:1 says. Matter of fact, the attack occurred just after harvest time in the spring, Joshua 2:6 says, Joshua 3:15. The siege was short, it says in Joshua 6. The walls were leveled, possibly by an earthquake. The city was not plundered, and the city was burned. The only problems that remain is the date. Most scholars will reject the possibility that the Israelites destroyed Jericho in about 1400 because their belief that Israel did not emerge in Canaan until 150 to 200 years later. So what they do is they reject Israel as the conquering army because they already presuppose that Israel didn't yet exist. They think that Israel started as a small tribe who gradually infiltrated Canaan and then grew larger and larger. But again, that's a presupposition, and you have to assume that. The evidence that we can study, though, does line up very well with the Joshua narrative. And that's pretty amazing because you're talking about 3,600 years ago. And we're able to at least see that there's no direct conflict with the Joshua story. See, that's not bad. That's not bad. Okay.